The sun was a hammer swung from a white-hot forge, striking the alkali flats of Dry Lantern Basin until the very air buckled. It was noon, high noon, and only a fool or a man paid for it would be out in this. Elias Hart was the latter, though sometimes he figured he was the former, too. He rode the fence line, his dun gelding picking its way through brittle sage and knife-sharp rock. This was the job. This was the routine. The wire was his catechism. Post, wire, post, wire. He counted them like beads. He counted the heat-struck cattle shimmering in the distance. He counted the miles back to his sod-roofed house. Routine was safety. Routine was the wall he built against the memory of chaos, against the years the locusts ate, against the long quiet of the brother he'd buried near this very line. The heat was a physical weight, pressing the brim of his hat against his brow, baking the sweat into salt tracks on his shirt. The world was bleached gray, brown, and a blinding, painful white. Full. Then, a patch of the wrong color. It wasn't much, a ragged flutter, low in the scrub by the crooked spine of a lone, dying cottonwood. It was a dark shape in a world that heat had burned clean of shadows. Elias reined in the dun. The horse stopped, grateful, dropping its head. Elias didn't dismount. He listened. The only sound was the high, thin scream of cicadas, a noise so constant it was just another flavor of silence. The long, deep quiet of trouble just passed. He nudged the gelding forward, one slow step at a time. His hand rested near the worn grip of the Winchester in its scabbard. Not fear, just habit. The shape resolved. It was a body, a person, curled tight, half hidden by the thorny branches of a greasewood bush. A saddle blanket, military-issue gray with a black stripe, was pulled up to their chin. Elias swung down, the dry crunch of his boots on the gravel sounding like a gunshot. He moved closer. It was a woman. She was collapsed, not resting. She looked like a bundle of laundry dropped from a wagon, all sharp angles of bone beneath thin cloth. Her hair was matted with burrs and pale dust. Her lips were split, cracked open to the meat, caked with a mixture of dirt and dried blood. Thirst, a bad way to go. He knelt, his own throat suddenly tight and dry. He looked at her face, trying to gauge her age. Young, maybe 20, maybe less. Too young to be used up this badly by the land alone. Then he saw the sign. It was staked into the ground not 5 feet from her, a splintered piece of planking, maybe from a freight crate. It was painted with thick, tar-black words, sloppy but clear. No mercy for thieves. Elias's gut went cold, colder than the noonday heat should allow. This wasn't the desert claiming a victim. This was a judgment. This was man's work. He stood up fast, his body going rigid. His gaze snapped from the woman to the horizon. He scanned the ridges, the low cuts in the earth, the dark mouths of the arroyos. He looked for dust. He looked for the glint of sun on a rifle barrel, the shift of a horse standing in shadow. Nothing. The basin was empty. It was just him, the woman, the sign, and the cicadas. The trouble was gone, but it had left its signature. He turned back to the woman. His first instinct survival was satisfied. His second mercy, the kind he rarely got to use, took over. He unhooked his canteen. The slosh of the water was a heavy, precious sound. He knelt beside her again, his shadow falling across her face. He thumbed the cork open. He didn't pour the water on her lips. A person that far gone might choke, or fight for it, and he couldn't spare a drop. He tipped the canteen, letting a few drops fall onto the parched dirt beside her cheek. The smell of the water, cool and metallic, rose in the hot air. He was testing if she'd flinch, if she'd turn toward the scent. She didn't. She only shivered. A deep, racking tremor that shook her thin frame. A vibration of shock and failing life that had nothing to do with the 100-degree heat. He wet his fingers and touched them to her lips, gently, letting the moisture seep into the cracks. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. He assessed her, his rancher's eyes taking inventory of the damage. Her wrists, laying limp on the dirt, were raw. The skin was rubbed clean off in angry, weeping grooves, bruised black and purple at the edges. Rope burns. She had been tied, and tied tight, for a long, long time. Her boots were a tragedy. One was a man's cavalry boot, the heel worn crooked, sizes too large. The other was a flimsy thing, a woman's town boot with little buttons, the sole split wide open, beneath the busted lace of the town boot. Her ankle was swollen thick as a tree limb, the skin stretched tight and purple. He brushed a hand near her mouth. A breath, thin as a spider's web, touched his skin, a sand-dry rasp. Her eyes opened, just slits at first, peering out from beneath swollen lids. They were bright, too bright. The fever was burning high, but behind the fever, he saw it. It wasn't just fear, it wasn't pleading. It was a hard, cold core of defiance. She was looking at him, not through him, even now, at the bottom of the well. She was sizing him up. That look decided him. Elias stood and read the rest of the story written in the dirt. He was a tracker, and the ground spoke plain. There were drag marks, where she had been pulled from a horse. There were boot prints, several sets, scuffed, messy, but one print was clear, pressed deep by a man who stood and watched. A squared military heel, cavalry issue, or at least a boot stolen from a soldier. He kicked at the dirt, a small glint of brass. He bent and picked it up. A cartridge casing, 4570. He scanned and found 3 more, scattered in a rough circle. They hadn't just left her. They had staged a lesson, fired shots around her, or into the air, to make the lesson stick. This was a performance of cruelty. He went back to her. He pulled the big skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. She saw the movement, and that defiant spark in her eyes guttered, replaced by a sudden, stark terror. "Easy, ma'am," he said. His voice was rough, like stones rattling in a dry creek bed. "Just for this." He turned the knife, not on her, but on his own shirt. He cut a long, clean strip from the hem. He sacrificed the cloth, knowing it was the only clean thing he had. He soaked it with precious water from his canteen and knelt by her swollen ankle. He was gentle, but the work was hard. He had to bind it tight, to keep the swelling from getting worse. She hissed when he moved her, a sharp intake of breath, but she didn't fight him. He wrapped the wet cloth firmly, securing it with a knot. He looked at the saddle blanket she clutched. It was coarse, smelling of horse sweat and the alkaline dust. He gently pulled it from her grip, shook it once a small scorpion fell out and scurried away. And then he unfolded it. He tucked it around her shoulders, covering the raw skin of her arms, pulling it up to her chin. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a vow, a pledge he hadn't spoken yet. His eyes fell on the sign again. "No mercy for thieves." He hated it. He hated the tar. He hated the splintered wood. He hated the self-righteousness of it. It was a curse left nailed to the earth. He wouldn't leave it for the wind to repeat. He put his boot on the base of the plank and tore it from the ground. The wood snapped. He carried the pieces back to his horse and jammed them into his saddle roll. He would burn them later, at his own fire. Now, the hard part. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice low. "This is going to hurt. I'm moving you." He slid one arm under her back, the other under her knees. She weighed nothing. A bundle of twigs and fever. She let out a low groan as her body lifted from the dirt, a sound that came from deep inside her. He carried her to the dun gelding. The horse shied, snorting at the unfamiliar, sharp scent of fever and blood. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured. "Easy now." He couldn't mount and lift her. He had to set her in the saddle first, sideways, like a sack of feed. She slumped against the saddle horn. He swung up behind her, a smooth, practiced motion, and settled into the seat. He reached around, pulling her upright. She collapsed back against him. her head lolled, her matted hair brushing his chin. He could feel the terrible, dry heat radiating from her, even through the thick canvas of his shirt. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her steady against his chest. He turned the horse, not toward Ash Mesa, not toward town, where questions would fly like bullets. He turned the horse toward his own place, Blue Coyote Ranch. It was a long, slow mile, and every step of the gelding would be a jolt of pain for her. He knew it, but it was the only way. As they moved, a shadow passed over them. He looked up. 3 vultures, black specks against the white-hot sky, pivoted in a slow, patient circle. They had been waiting. They had smelled the end of the story. Elias stared at them, his face hard as the rock beneath his horse's hooves. He tipped the brim of his hat low, shielding his eyes, hiding the woman from their view. He made a silent promise to the empty air. He promised the vultures nothing. They would not have this one. And to the stranger, the broken, fever-bright woman who weighed nothing in his arms, he promised everything he could carry. The one-room house was built of sod and stubbornness, dug halfway into the earth to escape the summer heat and the winter wind. It smelled of dust, old wood smoke, and the faint, clean scent of the lye soap Elias made himself. It was a room of plain, hard purpose. A stove, a table, a chair, a bed. His life, pared down to the essentials. He carried her in. She was so light, her weight was a question, an accusation. Her head rolled against his shoulder, her breath a hot, shallow puff against his neck. He crossed the worn plank floor in 3 strides and gently, so gently, laid her on his bed. The bed was his one small comfort, a real mattress stuffed with corn husks, and sheets, clean sheets, washed last Monday, smelling of sun and air. He hesitated, looking at the grime and blood caked on her thin clothes, the filth of her journey. He looked at his clean sheets. Then he laid her down anyway. The dirt was just dirt. It would wash out. He pulled the gray, military-issue saddle blanket from his roll, the one she had clutched in the desert, and spread it over her. It was a strange comfort, covering her with the very thing that had been her only shield. But it was warm, and it was hers. He spread it over the clean white sheets, a line drawn between his world and the one that had thrown her away. She didn't stir. Her body settled into the mattress, a broken puppet with its strings cut. For a long minute, Elias just stood there, his hat in his hands. The silence of the room was heavy, thick with her fevered breathing. He was a man of routine, and this was not routine. This was a rock dropped into the still, deep pool of his days. Then the routine took over, but in a new shape. He moved to the black iron stove. He lifted a lid with the hooked poker, the clank of metal loud in the quiet. He fed splintered juniper into the firebox, coaxing the embers back to life. He filled the kettle from the water barrel by the door and set it on to boil. He went to his supply chest, a rough-hewn pine box, and took out a small muslin sack. Inside was dried willow bark, chipped and pale. He crushed a handful in his palm, the dry, woody scent rising, and spooned it into a tin cup. When the kettle whistled, a high, thin sound that made the woman on the bed flinch in her sleep. He poured the steaming water over the bark, the room filled with the sharp, bitter smell of medicine, overlaying the smells of iron and old wool. He set the cup aside to steep. Next, salt. He took a pinch from his salt box and dissolved it in a small bowl of warm water. He grabbed a strip of clean muslin from the chest, the last of a bolt he'd bought 2 years ago in Ash Mesa. He sat on the single chair he dragged to the bedside. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, not expecting an answer, "this needs doing." He gently lifted her left hand. It was limp. Her fingers curled slightly. He dipped the muslin into the salt water and pressed it to her wrist. She woke in an instant. It wasn't a gentle rising. It was an explosion. Her eyes flew open, wide and white, but they saw nothing. She saw a shape, a shadow, a man leaning over her. She screamed, a dry, torn sound, more air than voice. She thrashed, trying to pull away, her heels digging into the mattress, her hands clawing at him, at the air. She was fighting his shadow more than him. "Easy, easy now," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't grab her. He didn't hold her down. He just held his ground, his hands open, the wet cloth raised. "I'm not them, I'm not them." The words didn't seem to reach her, but the lack of violence did. He wasn't striking. He wasn't yelling. He was just there. She collapsed back onto the pillow, her body seized by a violent, bone-rattling shake. Her teeth chattered. She was fighting, but her body had no reserves left. "Here," he said. He put down the cloth. He went and got the tin cup of willow tea. It was hot, but not scalding. He slid one hand beneath her head, lifting her just enough, and pressed the metal rim to her cracked lips. "Drink." She flinched from the cup, turning her head. "It's for the fever," he said, his voice patient. "It's just willow bark. Drink." The warmth, the bitter scent. Something finally broke through the terror. She stopped fighting. Her shaking hands came up, closing around his one hand that held the cup. Her grip was surprisingly strong, a drowning person's grip. She guided the cup to her own mouth and drank. She drank it all, in ragged, desperate swallows, the hot, bitter liquid spilling down her chin. When it was empty, she released the cup, and her head fell back onto his arm. He lowered her gently to the pillow. The shaking in her limbs began to quiet, replaced by a deep, exhausted stillness. Her eyes closed. He picked up the wet muslin again. This time, she didn't fight. He cleaned her wrists. The work was slow and awful. The rope had ground deep, through the skin, into the meat. The angry grooves were caked with dirt and dried blood. He washed them with the salt water, his broad, calloused thumb moving with a patience he usually reserved for a spooked horse or a newborn calf. He was methodical. He cleaned away the grit, patting the raw wounds dry. She winced, her breath hissing between her teeth, but she let him. He tore the muslin into 2 long strips and wrapped her wrists, covering the raw grooves. The white cloth was stark against her sun-scorched, dirty skin. He worked in silence, his hands doing all the talking. His hands said, "I am not the one who did this. I am the one who is undoing it." When he finished, he tended to her ankle, rewrapping the crude bandage he'd made on the trail with a fresh, clean strip, binding it tight to keep the swelling down. He looked at her, asleep again, or perhaps just unconscious, her breathing still too shallow. The room was growing dim as the sun slid behind the mesa. He lit the coal oil lamp, and the small room filled with a soft, yellow glow. He saw the fear that lingered even in her sleep, the way her fingers twitched. He knew questions were a kind of weapon right now. A man's voice asking who or why would sound just like the men who had left her. He set a simple rule for the room, for himself. No questions until she wanted them. The silence was mercy, not interrogation. But mercy needed a voice, too. He went to the small shelf by the door where he kept his accounts. He picked up his slate and a nub of chalk. He wiped the slate clean of its figures, so many pounds of feed, so many head counted, and wrote 3 words. He wrote them large and clear. "You are safe." He propped the slate on the chair beside the bed, angling it so the lamplight found the words first. It would be the first thing she saw if she woke in the night. A lighthouse, a promise. He stepped outside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The air was cooling, the desert bleeding purple and orange. He moved with purpose. He bedded the horses, the dun and his spare mare, in the corral. He gave them extra grain, leaving it close to their troughs. He hung his saddle high on the peg in the lean-to, not on the low rail. Everything looked like routine. But it was the routine of a man getting ready. A saddle hung high is out of the way, but it's also easier to grab in a hurry. Grain left close means a horse can eat fast. He didn't go back inside. He took his bedroll from the lean-to and spread it on the porch, near the door. He sat, leaning his back against the rough wood of the house. He set his Winchester beside him, its metal cool in the falling dark. He didn't take off his boots. He sat and watched the stars burn their way into the blackness. This was his company, the stars and the perimeter bells of the wild. A fox yipped in the distance. A great horned owl called from the cottonwoods down by the dry wash. He listened to the pitch of the wind, learning its habits. He was a sentinel, guarding a promise written on a slate. He must have drifted off, because the next thing he knew, the black sky had softened to a bruised, deep blue. Dawn was blushing the flat top of Ash Mesa. He stood, his back stiff, and rolled up his blanket. He didn't go in, not yet. He built up the fire in the outdoor pit, a ring of stones he used for cooking when the house was too hot. He put the coffee pot on to boil and set a heavy skillet over the flames. He mixed cornmeal and water, fried up 3 thick corn cakes, and heated a pot of leftover beans, stirring them until they bubbled. The smell of wood smoke, coffee, and savory beans was a good, solid smell. It was the smell of living. He scooped a portion onto a tin plate, a helping of beans, 1 corn cake. He poured a cup of the willow tea he'd kept steeping low on the stove all night. He balanced the plate and cup, pushed open the door, and went inside. The lamplight was gone, replaced by the thin gray light of morning. She was awake, her eyes were open, and they tracked him as he entered. The fever was still there, but the panic was banked. She was just watching, wary. He said nothing. He walked to the chair, took the slate, and set the plate and cup in its place, within her reach. He put the slate back on the floor, his message still clear. Then he turned and walked out. He had to give her privacy. He couldn't stand there and watch her. To be watched is to be judged. She had to be free to choose hunger over fear. He busied himself. He found his tools and went to the small smokehouse, where a hinge on the door had been busted for a month. He worked at it, pulling the old screws, whittling a small peg to fix the split wood, the squeak of the metal, the rasp of his knife. It was noise. It was a signal. I am here. I am busy. I am not watching you. He gave it half an hour, maybe more. When the hinge was solid, he wiped his hands on his pants and walked back to the house. He pushed the door open. She was sitting up, leaning against the headboard. The saddle blanket was pooled around her waist. She looked impossibly small in his bed. His eyes went straight to the chair. The cup was empty. The beans were half gone. The corn cake was gone completely. A slow breath he didn't know he was holding eased out of his chest. She had chosen. She had eaten. Then he saw the slate. She had it resting on her lap. His words, "You are safe," were still there. But beneath them, drawn with a shaking hand, was a new chalk mark. It wasn't a word. It was just one careful line, a single horizontal stroke. He looked at it. He looked at her. She was watching him, her dark eyes wide, trying to read his face. He understood. It wasn't a signature. It wasn't a yes. It was a test, a question. Are you still here? Did you mean it? What happens now? It was the smallest, bravest thing. A single line drawn against the emptiness. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, to acknowledge the mark. He turned to the counter. He took the half loaf of bread he'd baked 2 days ago and cut a thick slice. He found the jar of molasses and spread it thick, all the way to the crust. He refilled the tin cup, this time with water from the barrel. He walked back to her. She flinched, just slightly, as he approached, but she held her ground. He set the bread and the water on the chair where the plate had been. He saw her eyes follow the food, then lift to his. The wariness was still there, but something else had joined it. The hard, fever-bright defiance was softening, like hard-pan dirt after a long, slow rain. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of an exchange, a treaty without signatures. He had answered her line with bread. He stood in the doorway, the morning light framing him, casting his shadow long into the room. He spoke the first words he'd said to her since the night before, the first words that weren't a command or a comfort, but a statement. "Name comes later," he said, his voice quiet, final. "Living comes first." He turned and stepped back out onto the porch, leaving her alone with the food, the water, and the knowledge that her mark had been answered the morning after. Elias moved with a quiet, deliberate energy. He had a new chore, one that wasn't on his usual list. He left the woman still unnamed, still a ghost in his bed, and walked his yard. He wasn't mending fences. He was reading the ground. He scanned the hard-packed dirt around his small sod house, his eyes sharp. He checked the lean-to, the woodpile, the corral. Nothing. Just his own tracks and the familiar scatter of animal prints. Then he walked to the windmill. The windmill was his weak point. It was the only water for half a mile, a magnet for anything alive. The steady creak-squeak-creak of the rusted vanes was the heartbeat of the ranch. At its base, the cistern overflow kept a patch of ground perpetually damp, a perfect ledger for visitors. He saw it immediately. It wasn't his boot print, which was broad and worn at the heel. This one was different, pressed deep, as if the man had stood there for some time, watching the house. It was narrow. The heel was squared off, and in the center of the heel mark was a small, square nick. Elias knelt. He'd seen that print before, stamped in the dust outside the army depots. Cavalry issue. A cold, sharp feeling, entirely separate from the morning's chill, settled in his gut. This wasn't a drifter. This wasn't some lost soul. This was organized. This was the mark of the same boot he'd seen near where he found her. They hadn't just been passing through. They had been here, at his windmill, in the dark, while he sat on the porch. The thought made the hairs on his neck stand up. He stood, wiping the damp grit from his hands onto his pants. He looked back at his house. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a target. He walked to the main gate of the horse corral. The latch was a simple iron ring looped over a peg. It made almost no sound. He dug in his pocket and pulled out a long, tough strip of rawhide. He threaded it through the ring, tied it to the wooden post, and pulled the gate shut. The rawhide strip stretched tight, like a banjo string. He nudged the latch. The rawhide scraped and vibrated against the wood, letting out a high, thin cry. It was enough. No one could open that gate in the dark without the whole ranch hearing it. 12 miles east, in the sun-baked cluster of buildings called Ash Mesa, word was already traveling faster than rain in a drought. News didn't walk in a town like this. It jumped, from the blacksmith's forge to the livery, and settled in the one place that held it all, Soper's Mercantile. Cole Madden felt the shift in the air. Madden was a man who appointed himself to things. He wore a tin star he'd bought from a catalog, and called himself deputy, mostly because the real county sheriff was 2 days' ride south and didn't care what happened in the basin as long as the taxes got paid. Madden had thin patience and a thick mustache, and he thrived on the small, sour currency of other people's business. He was at the counter, ostensibly to buy a plug of tobacco. Phineas, the clerk, a man pale as the flour sacks he stacked, was weighing it out. "Getting dry," Cole said, tapping the counter. "Always is," Phineas replied, not looking up. "Heard Elias Hart's got himself a new hand," Cole said. The words were dropped casual, like a coin on the wood. Phineas stopped. His hand, holding the scoop, froze over the tobacco bin. Then he finished the motion, a fraction too fast. He gave a shrug. It was too large, a performative shrug that involved his whole upper body. It was a shrug designed to look like a shrug. "Dunno, Cole," Phineas said, his voice flat. "Elias keeps to himself. You know that." "Just heard things," Cole said, his eyes narrowing. "Ain't my business to listen," Phineas said, tying the small sack. That was the tell. In Ash Mesa, it was everyone's business to listen. The denial was louder than a confession. A secret was being sold. Right here, by its very absence. Cole Madden put his coins on the counter. He picked up his tobacco, but he left with something far more valuable. He left with a certainty he didn't own yesterday morning. Elias Hart, the loner, was hiding something. And Cole Madden hated secrets he wasn't in on. Back at the ranch, the woman was up. When Elias came back inside, the smell of wood smoke clinging to him. She was standing by the window. She was braced on the one-room house's only table, her weight on her good leg. She'd pulled the saddle blanket around her shoulders like a shawl. She was weak, trembling from the effort, but she was upright. She was studying the knife. Elias had used it to cut the bread and molasses, and he had left it on the table. A simple utility knife, blade sharp, handle worn smooth with his own sweat. He stopped in the doorway, watching her look at it. It lay between them, a line drawn in steel. He had left it there on purpose. It was a statement. I am not afraid of you. But it was also a question. Are you afraid of me? She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering over the wooden handle. She could have grabbed it, used it as a weapon, a shield, a threat. She was a cornered animal, but she didn't. Her fingers touched the wood, a light, inquisitive touch, and then pulled back. She saw him in the doorway, her body tensed, her eyes flying to his. Elias didn't move. He didn't look at the knife. He just looked at her, acknowledging her. She was a person, not just a patient. She turned, her movement stiff, and pointed one long shaking finger at the slate, which still sat on the chair. He understood. He picked up the small nub of chalk and held it out to him. She had to brace herself with one hand on the table to take it, a slow, deliberate motion. She turned the slate over to the clean side. She licked her lips, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her hand was shaking so badly the first stroke was a jagged line. She stopped, took a breath, and started again. The letters came crooked, climbing uphill, but they were clear. 2 words. Don't tell. She finished and tapped the chalk against the slate. A small, sharp sound. Tap, tap. Her eyes were fierce, desperate, burning with a fever that was part sickness and part terror. It wasn't a request. It was an order from someone who had nothing left to bargain with. Elias held her gaze. He thought of Cole Madden, of Phineas's too quick denial, of the boot print by his well. I don't go to town less I need to, he said. His voice was a low rumble, but it was a vow. As if her words, her fear, had summoned them. His gaze drifted past her, through the small, wavy glass of the window, to the far ridge line. His body went still. A small halo of dust, pale gold in the mid-morning sun, was blooming on the horizon. It wasn't a wagon. It was small, tight, 2 riders. They weren't heading for the pass. They were sitting still, 2 black cutouts against the bright, empty sky. They were looking right at the ranch, looking right at him. The woman saw the change in his face. She tried to turn, but Elias moved, stepping between her and the window, blocking her from view. Get back in the bed, he said. His voice was flat, all the softness gone. What is it? She whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Just 2 men, he said, looking at the land. But they weren't. They were looking at his house. They sat for a long, stretched-out minute, a minute where Elias could feel his own heart beating a heavy, slow time against his ribs. Then, one of the riders gestured. They turned their horses, not quickly, not in a panic, but slowly. They angled away, as if they had just been pausing to rest their mounts, as if they were pretending they hadn't been watching at all. The pretense was the worst part. It meant they weren't lost. It meant they had a purpose, and it meant they would be back. Elias watched until their dust was just a smudge. He turned back to the woman. She had sagged against the table, her face pale, the small burst of strength gone. He went to the pegs by the door and took down his Winchester. He laid it on the table. Next to the knife, he got his oilcloth and the small tin of gun oil. He levered the action open. Click-clack. The rifle was clean. He'd cleaned it 3 days ago. He didn't care. He began to clean it again. The rhythmic slide of the oiled rag, the metallic smell, the solid weight of the walnut stock in his hands. He worked the lever. Click-clack. He oiled the mechanism. He checked the sights. He needed his hands to be busy, to do a job they knew by heart. It was a way to steady the rib-deep tremor that had started in his chest. He was a man who liked routine, and the world was trying to break it. He opened his cartridge box and began lining the brass shells up on the table. 1, 2, 3, 10 in a row. They were heavy, deadly, and real. The woman watched him, her eyes wide. He looked at her ankle, propped on a pillow. The swelling was still bad. He looked at her face, flushed with fever. "That ankle needs a sawbones," he said, his voice quiet, almost to himself. "You need quinine." She shook her head, a fast, violent motion. "The nearest doctor is in Agua Fria," he said, still wiping the barrel. "That's 50 miles. He paused, setting the rag down. "And about 2 wrong questions away." He was telling her the truth. A doctor would ask her name. He would ask what happened. He would send a wire. And then men like Cole Madden, or worse, men with square-heeled boots, would come. She understood him perfectly. She lifted her hand and pointed to the clean white bandage on her wrist. Then she tapped her fingers firmly against her own chest. She shook her head, her eyes sharp and clear, the fever burning away the fog. No doctor. She firmed her jaw and made a gesture. She drew a line on her shoulder, like a uniform strap. She tapped her chest again. Some dangers wear uniforms. She had just confirmed everything the boot print had told him. The men who had left her to die were not just random brutes. They were men with authority. That night, Elias did not sleep on the porch. The air was too cold, the threat too close. But he didn't sleep in his bed. He watched the black square of the window until night folded thick and final over the basin. He took a long coil of twine from his supply chest and a small brass bell, the one he used to track his pack mule in high brush. He went outside into the dark. He strung a line, low to the ground. He tied one end to the porch rail, looped it through the new rawhide tie on the corral gate, and tied the other end to the bell, which he hung just inside his open door, where no stray wind could reach it. He sat on the porch for an hour, just listening. The wind played the twine, a soft thrum, but the bell was silent. He learned the pitch of the wind in the wire. He learned the sound of the house settling. He was learning the rhythm of the night, tuning his ears to hear the one single note that would be wrong. When he finally came inside, he pulled the door shut, leaving it unbarred. The bell hung silent, a small, brass promise of an alarm. The woman was in the bed, the saddle blanket pulled to her chin. He could see the whites of her eyes tracking him in the gloom from the dying embers in the stove. He took his bedroll and spread it on the floor, between her and the door. He lay down, boots on, his hat tilted over his eyes. The Winchester was beside him, its stock touching his arm. The house was quiet. He heard the creak-squeak of the windmill. He heard the scurry of a mouse in the sod wall. He heard the woman's breathing, shallow and fast. Hours passed. The square of the window turned from black to a deep, pale gray. Midnight. He heard a new sound, a rustle of wool. His body went utterly still, but he didn't move. He watched from under the brim of his hat. She was easing herself out of the bed. Her bare feet made no sound on the plank floor. She stood, a shadow in the darkness, clutching the blanket around her. She padded past him, her steps unsteady. He smelled the dry heat of her fever, the faint, bitter scent of the willow bark. She went to the chair. He heard the faint, dry scratch of chalk on slate, a tiny, fragile sound in the vast silence. She stood there for a long moment. Then, Just as quietly, she padded back to the bed and slid under the covers. Elias waited. He counted to 100, listening to her breathing settle. Then, he pushed himself up on one elbow. He looked at the slate, resting on the chair in the pale moonlight. His 3 words were still there. "You are safe." Her 2 words were there. "Don't tell." And now, at the bottom, drawn with a hand that must have been shaking, were 2 more. "Thank you." It was the loudest, most dangerous thing either of them had said. It was an alliance. It was a treaty signed in chalk, in the dark, with the enemy listening just over the ridge. For 2 days, the world was measured in tin cups of water, slices of bread, and the changing slant of light on the plank floor. The fever did not break. It simply retreated, like a tide going out, leaving her wrecked and weak, but present. She was no longer a ghost trapped in a dying animal. She was a woman, sitting upright in his chair, the gray saddle blanket still draped over her shoulders. Elias had not asked a single question. He had mended his tack, cleaned his rifle, and cooked his beans, moving around her as if she were a new and fragile piece of furniture. The silence, which had first been a mercy, had grown heavy. It was a silence that demanded to be filled. The thank you on the slate was not enough. It was a debt half paid. And she knew, better than anyone, what happened when debts were called in. She watched him. He was rubbing Neat's foot oil into a bridle strap, his hands broad and sure, the calluses on his palms catching the worn leather. He was a man who understood work. He understood the ground. He had not hurt her. He had cleaned her wounds. He had fed her. And he had, against all reason, brought her here. She had to give him something, not as payment, but as collateral, a piece of herself, to prove she was real. Her throat was raw, scarred by thirst and disuse. She tried to form a word, coughed, a dry, racking sound. Elias stopped his work. He didn't look up, not right away, granting her the dignity of the failure. He just waited. She tried again, tasting the sounds before she said them. "Naira." It came out as a whisper, thin as a moth's wing. It sounded strange, a name from a life lived by someone else, in a different world. She said it louder, finding a rough edge of voice. Naira Vega. The name hung in the air, fragile and strange, between the smell of the gun oil and the cold wood smoke from the stove. Elias set the bridle strap down. He turned, slowly, and looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a polite welcome. He just took the name, weighing it in his mind. He saw the cost of it, what it took for her to hand it to him. A name was a handle. A name was a way to be caught. He nodded once. He had to offer his in return, an equal trade. "Elias Hart," he said. His voice was plain. He offered nothing with it, no Mr. Hart, no title of rancher or owner, just the name. There was no preacher in that name, and no judge. It was just the man, standing on his own patch of dirt. The air in the room shifted. The heavy, pressurized silence of the unknown was gone, replaced by the sharper, thinner tension of the known. They were Elias and Naira. It was, in its own way, more dangerous. Naira pulled the blanket tighter. Now came the harder part. The why. Why the men? Why the sign? Why don't tell? She looked at the slate, but the story in her was too big for those few words. Her voice wasn't strong enough to tell it all. She needed another way. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a wooden crate he'd emptied of tinned beans that morning. It was near the stove, the pale, smooth wood of its back facing her. She pointed at it. "I need," she whispered. Elias watched her. He looked at the crate. He understood. He went to the stove, opened the firebox, and pulled out a small, cold piece of charcoal. He brought it to her. She took it. The black dust felt strange on her fingers. She turned in the chair, her body aching. and set the piece of wood on her lap. She began to sketch. Her hand shook. The first lines were jagged, uncertain, but the images were burned into her. She drew a circle of tents. Not army tents. These were smaller, rounder, some of canvas, some of hide. A camp. She drew a dozen of them, clustered near a wavy line that was a creek. Elias watched, his face impassive. He stood by the table, leaning a hip against it, his arms crossed. He read the drawing the way he read the ground. Beside the tents, Naira drew a symbol. It was a bird, its wings spread wide, but the feathering on one wing was split, broken. A split-wing hawk, her band's mark. This was us. Then she moved the charcoal to the other side of the crate. Her hand grew steadier, her motions harder, digging into the wood. She drew a line, and then another, and another, a long, segmented column, like a centipede, crawling over a rise toward the circle of tents. She gave the front of the column a small flag. She drew dots for men, squares for wagons. She drew it, and then she stared at it, her breath catching. The centipede of blue. She didn't have to explain. Elias knew that formation. He knew those uniforms. "Soldiers," Naira whispered. The word was poison. It tasted like ash. "They came. They said a removal." A removal. Such a clean word. Like sweeping dust. Elias said nothing, his jaw working under the stubble of his beard. "Ranchers," she said, her voice gaining a thin, hard edge. "Local men. They joined them. They wanted the water. They wanted the land. They wanted us gone." She looked down at the drawing, at the blue centipede touching the circle of tents. She pressed the charcoal to the drawing of the creek, the wavy line, and began to scribbling over it. A dark, angry motion, back and forth, until the water was gone, replaced by a black smudge. "A fire," she said, her voice flat. "It ran where the water used to run." Elias pushed himself off the table. He walked to the stove. The room was growing cold. He fed 2 small logs into the firebox, the iron lid clanging shut. The sound made her jump. He turned back, his face hard in the growing light from the fire. "The sign," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a prompt. "The one I found, thieves." Naira's face crumpled. This was the part that shamed her. It was a lie, a justification. She told him. The words came out in broken pieces, stones she was pulling from her own gut. A white woman, a rancher's wife, out near Meseta Draw. She had died, not by a raid, not by an arrow. "Her husband," Naira said, shaking her head. "He had a bad hand. He owed money. He had a darkness in him." She didn't have the words for the sin, but Elias understood. A man hiding his own brand of evil. "He found her," Naira continued. "And he told the soldiers at the fort he told them." She looked Elias in the eye. "He blamed savages." There it was. The one word that lit the fuse. The uniforms, they needed an answer. They needed a scapegoat. It was neat. Her people were already being removed. They were the easy answer. The husband's lie fit their narrative. So they came. They came for the thieves and murderers. "They rode on our camp," she said. She pointed to the black smudge on the crate. "Most scattered. The men they fought. But—" She trailed off. Elias looked at the bandages on her wrists. "And you?" She touched the muslin, her fingers tracing the clean white cloth that covered the raw, weeping grooves. "I was not fast enough. I was by the creek. They couldn't find the men who ran. They were angry. They had no one left to blame." She paused, swallowing. "So they used me." Elias felt his own hands clench. "They tied me to that cottonwood for bait." Her voice broke, but she forced it back. "Bait for the men, for my brother, or for the wolves. They didn't care which. They left the sign. No mercy for thieves. It wasn't for me. It was for whoever found me. A signpost." She looked at him. her eyes bright with fever and the unshed tears of memory, pain, made into a signpost. Elias listened. He listened until the new fire in the stove began to tick, the metal expanding with the heat. The sound was too loud in the small room. He looked at her, this broken thing that had drawn a map of her own destruction. His jaw worked. He was remembering. He was remembering his own brother, Wyatt, younger than him by 3 years. The spring the raiders came, not soldiers, just desperate men from over the border, pushed by their own famine. They took half the herd. Wyatt had ridden out, just to talk. He'd said they hadn't used guns. They'd used rope and a hot branding rail. Elias had found him too late, bled out on the high corral fence. He remembered the aftermath, the blame traded like hot coins, from hand to hand, until everyone was burned. The town blamed the army blamed the politicians blamed the raiders. No one was ever wrong. They were just right, and loud. He saw that same terrible, self-righteous fire in the story Naira told. Naira watched his face. It was a hard face, carved from the same rock as the mesas. She saw the muscles tighten in his jaw. She saw the coldness in his eyes. She was terrified. She had laid her weapons down, and now he held them all. What if I did?" she whispered, her voice shaking. It was the last, most desperate test. What if I was the one? What if I lit fires? Elias looked away from her, into the fire. He thought about Wyatt. He thought about the fire that burned where the water was. He thought about the lie of savages. He turned back to her. His voice was slow, dug from deep. "I reckon," he said, "I'd have asked why you lit him before I asked who you were." The answer hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't judgment. It was something else. Something she had never been offered. It was the sound of a man trying to see the whole map, not just the part he was standing on. The tension between them, the terrible friction of confession, didn't disappear. It just changed. In the flicker of the lamplight, blame suddenly seemed small. It was a luxury. What was real was the cold, the hunger, the smell of the oil, the roof, the ordinary, impossible miracle of two people being alive in the same square of light, when the world outside wanted them both dead for different reasons. Elias let out a breath. He owed her a confession of his own. "I don't trust crowds," he said, his voice quiet. He picked up the bridle strap again, but he didn't work it. He just held it. Or uniforms, or any man who's too certain he's right. He looked at the Winchester, resting on its pegs by the door. "I've been on both sides of a rifle in my life, stood behind it and stood in front of it. Found out both sides can be wrong. Sometimes they're wrong at the same time." That was his story. That was his creed. Naira listened. His words gave her the last piece of strength she needed. She pushed the crate away. She looked at him. Not at the slate, not at the floor. "I didn't kill," she said. Her voice was clear, low, and final. Not, "I'm not a thief," not, "I'm innocent." But the core of it, the thing that mattered. "I didn't kill that woman." Elias looked at her face, pale and streaked with charcoal dust. He looked at her wrists, her swollen ankle. He looked at the drawing of the broken-winged bird. He nodded. Once, a single solid motion that cost him nothing and gave her everything. "I believe you." Outside, as if on cue, a pack of coyotes started their high, yipping hymn to the rising moon. It was a lonely, wild sound, but it was honest. It was the sound of the world they both lived in. Inside the small sod house, the air that had been held tight for 3 days, thick with fever and fear and unspoken stories, finally let go. The room exhaled, one long, slow, shared breath that was one heartbeat longer than the last. The confession, once spoken, did not clear the air. It changed its pressure. The small sod house, which had been a sick room, a shelter, a confessional, now became something else entirely. It became a space defined by two people who had seen the bottom of the world and had pulled each other, inch by inch, from the edge. The days that followed were quiet, but the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of awareness. Elias was acutely aware of the way she moved, her limp lessening as the swelling in her ankle finally began to recede. He was aware of the way her hair, washed with his harsh lye soap and water from the barrel, was starting to show its true color, a dark brown that held a hint of red in the lamplight. Naira, in turn, was aware of him. She watched his hands. She had, for days, seen them only as tools that could clean a wound, lift a cup, oil a rifle. Now, she saw the man they were attached to. She saw the way his broad shoulders slumped just a fraction when he thought she wasn't looking, the weight of his own history settling on him. She saw the way his eyes, the color of gunmetal, would soften when he looked at his gelding, a tenderness he didn't know how to use on people. The storm was building. There was no thunder, no flash of lightning. It was the low, heavy, electric pressure that bends the air just before the sky breaks. It was in the way their hands brushed when he passed her a plate of beans. It was in the way she held his gaze a second longer than was necessary, a second longer than was safe. It was in the fact that Elias had not moved his bedroll from the floor, but he was starting to hate the cold planks. They had run out of reasons to step back. They had shared their stories, their weapons. There was nothing left to hide behind. That night, Elias was sitting at the table, running a whetstone along the blade of his skinning knife. Shh. The sound was a rhythm, a meditation, a way to keep his hands busy. Naira was sitting on the edge of the bed, the gray saddle blanket draped around her. She was mending the shirt he had cut a strip from. Her stitches were small and neat. She was paying him back, in the only currency she had. The sound of the stone on steel was the only noise, save for the ticking of the stove. Naira set the shirt down. She looked at her own hands, at the raw, new pink skin of her wrists where the rope burns were healing. He had tended those wounds. He had seen her at her most broken. She stood up, her ankle, still wrapped, took her weight. She took one step, then another. She crossed the small divide of the room. Elias heard the floorboard creak. He stopped his work, the knife and stone held still in his hands. He did not look up. He felt her presence, the small circle of warmth she brought with her. She stood beside him. He could smell the clean scent of her skin, the wool of the blanket, the faint, lingering bitterness of the willow bark he'd fed her. Her hand, the one with the freshly healed wrist, lifted. It hovered in the air between them, a small, pale bird, uncertain of where to land. It hovered over his arm, the one resting on the table, the one that held the whetstone. His forearm was corded with muscle, dusted with dark hair, and marked by the sun and the land. She was asking, without a single word, "May I?" Elias did not move. He did not look at her. He just stilled. He let out a breath, so slowly it was almost imperceptible. He loosened his grip on the stone. He did not flinch, did not pull away. He answered her unspoken question by giving her the choice. He let her set the distance. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, landed on his wrist. Her touch was light, so light, it was barely a touch at all. It was the weight of a dried leaf, but it burned him like a brand. It was the first gentle human touch he had felt in so many years he could not count them. Her fingers explored. Slowly, they traced the map of the veins on the back of his hand. They felt the hard ridge of his knuckles. And then, her thumb moved, sliding up his forearm, over the rolled-up sleeve of his shirt, to the pale skin above his elbow. She found it, the white, puckered seam of an old scar, a long, ugly line that ran 3 inches down his inner arm. It was a knife wound, from a fight in a cattle town a lifetime ago. A fight that had involved his brother, Wyatt. It was a mark of his failure, of the anger he carried. He kept it covered, always. Her thumb stroked the scar. Once, then twice. She was not recoiling. She was not judging. She was reading. She was reading the scripture of his past, the parts he himself had forgotten how to recite. He felt a knot in his chest, something he'd held tight since Wyatt died. Suddenly, pull, threatening to come undone. He raised his head and looked at her. Her eyes were not full of fear. They were not full of pity. They were full of understanding. She, who had been marked by rope, was acknowledging his mark, his own history of being bound and cut. "We go slow," Elias said. His voice was a rasp, thick with something he couldn't name. It was not a command. It was a plea. It was a promise. We go slow because the world goes too fast. We go slow because everything that has happened to you was fast and violent. We go slow because this is the only way I know how to be gentle. Naira held his gaze, a small, slow nod. She understood. The room, the small, sod-walled house, seemed to gather them both in a warm hush. The creak squeak of the windmill outside, the coyotes calling on the ridge, it all faded, until the only sound was the beat of his own blood, loud in his ears. She was still standing, and he was sitting. He put the knife and the whetstone on the table, very carefully. He stood up, pushing the chair back. He was taller than her, and for a second, his shadow fell over her, and he saw a flicker of the old fear in her eyes, the memory of the men, of the shadows that meant pain. He stepped back, giving her space. The gray saddle blanket, her shield, her roof, had slipped from one of her shoulders. It hung precariously. Elias reached out, not for her, but for the blanket. He lifted the heavy, coarse wool. He didn't pull it away. He opened it, like a pair of wings, and he settled it around them both. He pulled her in, not into an embrace, but into a shared space. He draped the other end over his own shoulders. Now, they stood together under the same roof, a small house, built of sun-baked wool and a promise he had just made. She was close. He could feel the warmth of her, feel her breath. She looked up at him, her lips parted, her eyes dark in the lamplight. This was the river, and they were already standing in it. He lowered his head. He gave her time to turn away, to pull back. She did not. She rose on her toes, just slightly, to meet him. The kiss they shared was unhurried. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of a storybook. It was a kiss of arrival. It was the press of warmth against the cold. A promise kept. It was salt and dust and the faint, bitter taste of willow bark. It was two people who had forgotten what this felt, this simple, quiet language of the mouth. Her breath, which had been shallow and fast, suddenly steadied. He felt his own shoulders, which he'd held high and tight for a decade, loosen, dropping an inch. There was no rush to cross the river. He lifted his hands. He did not grip her, did not pull her closer. His hands, calloused and rough, mapped only safe country. His thumb brushed her cheek, feeling the soft skin that had been cracked and burned by the sun. His fingers moved to her temple, pushing back a stray strand of hair. He let his hand rest there, just feeling the thrum of her pulse, a small, bird-like beat. His other hand found the long, thick braid of her hair, his fingers learning its weight, its shape. He was reassuring her. "I am here. My hands are not weapons." Her hands, which had been trapped between them, found their own way. They slid up his chest, over the rough canvas of his shirt. They were small against the breadth of him. Her fingers found the back of his neck, beneath his collar. They found the tight, knotted muscles where his worry lived, the place where he carried the weight of the ranch, the sky, the memory of his brother, and now, her. Her fingers gentled it. They massaged the tension, her touch hesitant at first, then firmer. She was healing him. She pulled back, just enough to look at him, and she laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was a soft, amazed puff of air. It was a sound of discovery. It was as if warmth, simple human warmth, was a new language she had just learned to speak in a single, surprised syllable. The sound of it broke something in Elias. He rested his forehead against hers. They stood there, under the blanket, their breath mingling, their eyes closed. They talked. They didn't talk of love. They didn't talk of the past. They talked about the future. "The sun," he murmured, his voice low, his lips moving against her brow. "It comes up over that east ridge, gives about 10 minutes of warning before it's full in your eyes." "We'll need to be gone before then," she whispered back. She wasn't just talking about the sunrise. She was talking about the riders. "We can follow the sluice south," he said. "The shale won't hold tracks, not if we're careful." "2 horses," she said, her voice practical. But her hand was still on his neck, her touch gentle. "The sorrel mare, is she broken?" "Enough," he said. "She'll carry you." They were planning their escape, but it felt like they were building a home. They were braiding their logistics, their survival, into this new, fragile intimacy. Elias reached back and, without moving his forehead from hers, found the small knob on the coal oil lantern. He turned it down. The flame guttered, shrank, and the room was plunged into a deep, soft gloom, lit only by the red glow from the stove's grate. He didn't turn it out. He left a small bead of light, a beacon. He guided her, still wrapped in the blanket, to the bed. He sat, and she sat beside him. The scene, the small room, closed in on them. There was no one else in the world. He found her hand in the darkness and laced his fingers with hers, his rough, calloused palm against her smoother, softer one. His hand was large, and it swallowed hers completely. They sat in the quiet, in the shared dark, with the wind picking up outside, pressing against the small house. Naira's voice came, clear and steady. She was no longer whispering. "I choose this," she said. Elias's hand tightened on hers. He heard the words. He heard what she was truly saying. She, who had been tied to a tree. She, who had been used as bait, as a signpost. She, who had every choice taken from her by violence and fear. She was taking one back. She was planting her flag in this small, dark patch of ground. Him, this moment. He heard the vow. It was a vow even a preacher in a black coat, with a book full of holy words, could not write better. It was the truest thing he had ever heard. Outside, the thin skeletal shadows of the juniper bushes braided themselves together in the moonlight, becoming one dark, complex shape. Inside, in the warm gloom, 2 lives, which had been braided tight with fear and loneliness, began, finally, to unbraid. The law, when it finally came, didn't ride in like thunder. It rode in with the steady, patient pace of a man checking a ledger. Lieutenant Silas Brand rode out from Dust Candle Station, a small, sun-blasted outpost 50 miles to the north. He was a man who believed in paper. Paper was clean. Paper held facts, and paper could be folded and put in a pocket, which was more than you could say for justice. In his pocket, Brand carried 2 pieces of paper. One was an army dispatch, poorly printed, describing a brown-eyed thief, female, last seen near Meseta Draw, wanted for questioning in connection with a burned storehouse. The other was a list, handwritten by Brand himself, titled Sympathizers. It was a short list, but Brand was a patient man. He did not ride alone. The army traveled in 2s and 3s, and he had a young, stiff-backed trooper with him. But his most valuable asset was not the trooper. It was the man he met at the Three Forks crossing. Cole Madden had been waiting, whittling a stick in the thin shade of a willow. He'd seen the army dust from town and rode out fast. This was his chance. "Lieutenant," Madden said, touching the brim of his hat. His tin star, pinned crooked on his vest, looked cheap in the harsh light. "Madden," Brand replied. He didn't dismount. He looked down at the self-appointed deputy. Brand disliked volunteers. They were messy. "Figured you might be riding this way," Madden said, trying to sound casual. "Heard some troubling news from the fort." "Is that so?" Brand said, his voice flat. Madden traded his rumors for the one thing he craved: favor from a man with real authority. He told Brand about Elias Hart, the loner, the man who kept to himself. He told him about Phineas the clerk and the shrug that said everything. He told him how Hart hadn't been to town in over a week, not since the very day the trouble at Meseta Draw had started. "He's got someone at that ranch," Madden insisted, his voice dropping. "Hiding him." "A woman. I'd wager Hart ain't the type to hire new hands, especially not ones he has to hide." Brand listened. He'd heard Hart's name. It was on his list of sympathizers, a man who'd once told a cavalry patrol to water their horses downstream from his own stock and to get off his land. A man who didn't respect the uniform. Madden saw his words landing. He tucked a grin under his mustache. "It's the Blue Coyote Ranch, just beyond Ash Mesa. Can't miss it." Brand nodded. Once. He didn't thank Madden. He simply nudged his horse forward, and Madden and the trooper fell in beside him. Elias saw the dust curtain long before he saw the riders. He was on the roof of the soddy, patching a spot where the wind had torn the earth away. He froze. His shovel held low. The dust was different from yesterday's. It wasn't the tentative, watchful dust of the two scouts. This was the confident, steady plume of men who knew exactly where they were going. He scrambled down the rough ladder, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He stood in the yard, watching the dust grow. His eyes slitted against the sun. He counted the moving shadows within the plume. 3. 3 today meant more tomorrow. 3 today meant the time for talking was over. He moved, his body a well-oiled machine of grim purpose. He didn't run. He walked, fast, into the house. Naira was by the stove, stirring a small pot of beans. She looked up, sensing the shift in him. "Elias." He didn't answer. He went to the corner where the empty bean crates sat, the one with her charcoal drawing on it, the map of her past, the circle of tents, the split-wing bird, the blue centipede. He grabbed it. "What are you—" He went to the far wall, near his bed, where a single floorboard was known to him to be loose. He jammed his fingers into the crack, pulled it up, revealing a dark, shallow space beneath. He shoved the wooden plank, drawing side down, into the dirt. He kicked the board back into place, the sound a dull, final thump. He was burying her story. He was hiding the proof. "Elias, you're scaring me." "They're here," he said, his voice flat. He went to the supply chest. He grabbed a burlap sack. He began to move. Water canteen. He filled it from the barrel. His hands steady. A long coil of jerky, hard as wood. He dumped the rest of his cartridge box into the sack. The heavy brass shells landed with a heavy, final thud. He set the sack by the back door, the door he'd built for cross breezes, which now, he realized, he had built for escape. Naira was pale, her hand at her throat. "How many—" "3, he said. "1 is Cole Madden." The Tin Star," she whispered. "The other 2 are Army." He saw her face. He saw the memory of the uniform flash in her eyes, a stark, white terror that stole her breath. He went to the pegs and took down the Winchester. He didn't oil it this time. He just held it, its weight familiar. "Stay away from the window," he said. "Don't make a sound. Let me do the talking." He stepped onto the porch and waited. The riders came up slow. They fanned out as they approached the house, a classic, tactical approach. The trooper stayed back, his hand on his carbine. Cole Madden reined in near the corral, his face alight with smug discovery. Lieutenant Silas Brand rode right up to the porch, stopping his horse a dozen feet from where Elias stood. He was a man in his 40s, his face burned red by the sun, his blue uniform jacket buttoned to the throat despite the heat. "Elias Hart," Brand said. It wasn't a question. Elias said nothing. He leaned against the porch post, the Winchester held easy in the crook of his arm, its barrel pointing at the dirt. "I'm Lieutenant Brand," the man said. "Dust Candle Station. We're looking for a fugitive, connected to a burned-out storehouse and some trouble up at Meseta Draw." "That's so," Elias said. His voice was flat. "Basin's full of trouble." Brand's eyes were the color of a pale, cold sky. "We have a report of a thief, a young woman, brown eyes. Might have come this way." "I don't get many visitors," Elias said. "We heard you got a new hand," Cole Madden called out, his voice sharp with impatience. He nudged his horse forward, trying to get a look past Elias, into the house. "My ranch keeps its own accounts, Madden," Elias said, his voice dropping low. "Dangerous. I don't owe you an inventory. Now, see here, Hart," Madden started, swinging his leg to dismount. He was done with talking. He was going to use his star. He planted one boot on the ground and made to step onto the porch. Click. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the sound of a hammer being drawn back on a rifle. Elias hadn't moved. He hadn't raised the rifle. He had just brought it level, its muzzle now pointing not at the dirt, but at the center of Cole Madden's chest. The Winchester appeared in his hands, patient and persuasive. Madden froze, his foot hovering over the porch step. "You're not invited, Cole," Elias said, his voice quiet as a snake's rustle. "Hart," Lieutenant Brand said sharply. His own hand had moved, resting on the flap of his holster. "Put the rifle down." "I'm on my own property." "Lieutenant," Elias said, his eyes never leaving Madden. "He's not. Tell your dog to stay in the yard." The air was so tight it vibrated. The trooper had unslung his carbine. Madden was sweating, his face mottled. He looked at Brand, appealing for help. Brand stared at Elias. He saw a man who wasn't afraid, who was on his own land, and who knew how to use the rifle he was holding. He also saw a man who was defending an empty porch. This wasn't a fight Brand could win today, not without blood, and he preferred paper. "Madden," Brand said, his voice clipped. "Get back on your horse." "But, Lieutenant..." "That's an order." Madden's face went dark with fury. He stepped back, his boot thudding in the dust, and swung back into his saddle, yanking the horse's head around with a vicious tug. Brand looked at Elias. The rifle was still level. "You're making a mistake, Hart, a bad one." "Just keeping my fences," Elias said. "Is that so?" Brand gathered his reins. He wasn't finished. This was just a different kind of attack. "You should know. Hart, a lot of good men get in trouble trying to help the wrong people. And the law has a long memory." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conversational, chilling tone. "A rope that's a messy, loud business. Makes folks upset. But paper," he said, tapping the pocket of his jacket. "Paper is quiet. Paper is official. Paper hangs people just as high and a whole lot quieter than rope." He held Elias's gaze for one long, cold second. Then he turned his horse. "We'll be back," he said. He rode out, the trooper and a fuming Cole Madden following him. Elias stood there. He stood until their dust was a smudge on the horizon again. He stood until he could hear the creak squeak of his own windmill. He lowered the rifle. He let the hammer down. Gently, he breathed. He turned and went inside, pulling the door shut. Naira was exactly where he'd left her, but she was pressed back against the far wall, as if trying to push herself through the sod. Her hands were shaking so badly she was holding them clamped together in her lap. She had watched it all. She had seen the blue uniforms that had once defined the border of her world. The men who had tied her to a tree. They were here. They had found her. Elias put the rifle on its pegs. He went to the stove, grabbed the coffee pot, and poured the last of the thick, black liquid into a tin cup. He didn't say, "It's all right." He didn't say, "They're gone." He just walked over and slid the warm cup into her clamped hands. Her hands steadied. just enough to hold it. The warmth, the solid, real object, was an anchor. She drank, the coffee hot and bitter. "They'll be back," she whispered. "I know," he said. "They'll come with paper and more men." "I know." She looked up at him, the terror in her eyes being baked hard, replaced by the old, defiant fire. "We can't be here when they do." The chessboard was set. The choices had narrowed to one. Elias pulled his chair to the table. He took a piece of flour sack paper, the back of which held his feed accounts. He dipped a pen in his inkwell. "We go tonight," he said. They bent over the paper, their heads close in the dimming light. He drew their escape. "We can't go north," he said, drawing a line. "That's Dust Candle. We can't go east. That's Ash Mesa." "South," Naira said, "through the Badlands." "It's hard country," he said, "but it's honest." He sketched the routes. "West to Coffin Switch, but that's a trading post. We'll be seen." He crossed it out. "South, then through St. Martha Wash. It's deep. It'll hide us. But it's a bottleneck. If they guess right, they trap us." "There's another way," he said. He moved the pen, drawing a thin, jagged line that cut away from the wash. "A hidden cut. My brother Wyatt and I found it. Devil's Sluice. It's high shale. It'll be hard on the horses, but it won't hold a track. It'll take us all the way to the San Isidro Bend." "Devil's Sluice," she said, testing the name. "We go there. We ride under the moon," Elias insisted. "We'll be over the first ridge before they even wake up." Naira nodded. She was with him. But then her eyes went to the door. "There's one more thing. We're taking the sack. Nothing else." "No," she said, her voice firm. "We take the sign, the one you brought back." Elias stared at her. "Naira, that's a plank of wood. It's weight we don't need." "We need it," she said, her voice fierce. "I'm not running from it. I'm not leaving it here for them to find. We carry it, and we burn it. We burn it somewhere high, where the wind can hear us choose." He looked at her, at the absolute certainty in her face. This was not a negotiation. It was a ritual. It was the price of her freedom. He nodded. "We'll tie it to my saddle." As dusk cooled the basin, they moved. Elias went to the corral. He saddled the dun gelding, his own steady mount. Then he approached the sorrel mare, a young, nervous thing he'd barely had time to break. She shied from him, her eyes white. Naira came up beside him, ignoring his warning. She held out her hand to the mare. The horse snorted, stamping. "Easy," Naira murmured, her voice a low, soft hum. She didn't move to touch the horse. She just stood, her hand out. "Easy now. We're all of us running." The mare's ears, which had been pinned back, flickered. She took one step, then another. She stretched her neck and touched her soft nose to Naira's palm. Naira stroked the mare's neck, her hand gentle, finding the tense muscles. The animal let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound like a door that had been locked for a very long time, finally opening. Elias watched them. He finished saddling the mare. He tied the burlap sack and the splintered sign plank to his own saddle. He looked back at the small sod house. It was just a shape in the purple twilight, a box of dirt that had, for a few days, been a sanctuary. It was already a memory. By morning, it would be a clue. They rode at last light. The sun was a bleeding wound on the western horizon, spilling apricot and violet into the high, thin clouds. The basin floor, which had been a white-hot anvil all day, was now a sea of cooling, purple shadow. They did not run, they slipped. They moved like water, finding the lowest path, skirting the wide, open flats and keeping to the deep arroyos, where the ghosts of ancient rivers had carved paths through the stone. The cottonwoods, which lined these dry washes, were black, skeletal stitches in the gray fabric of the dusk. Their leaves rustled, a dry, papery sound that was the only voice besides the plodding, sand-muffled thud of the horse's hooves. Elias led, the dun gelding moving with a sure-footed, grim purpose. The splintered sign plank was tied to his saddle roll, a dark, ugly burden that seemed to hum with its own bad history. Naira followed on the sorrel mare. She rode low in the saddle, her body moving in perfect, fluid time with the animal. She had taken to the horse as if she were born to it, the mare's earlier skittishness replaced by a steady, shared understanding. They were two creatures who had been hunted, and they moved as one. Naira kept her eyes fixed on the dark shape of Elias's hat brim. It was her compass, her anchor. She matched her breathing to the rhythm of his shoulders, a slow, measured cadence. Inhale on the rise, exhale on the fall. It was a logistic of survival that had become as intimate as a shared breath. For 2 hours, they rode through this maze of cuts and shadows. The land itself was their accomplice, hiding them, muffling their passage. The sliver of a new moon rose, casting just enough cold, blue light to turn the rock formations into looming, watchful giants. Then, Elias reined in. He held up a hand. Naira stopped the mare, her own hand instantly going to the horse's neck to keep her quiet. They were at the mouth of it. St. Martha Wash was wide, a sandy highway, but to their left was a crack in the world. A fissure in the rock wall that was barely wide enough for a horse to pass. It looked less like a path and more like a scar. "Devil's Sluice," Elias said. His voice was a low rumble, swallowed instantly by the stone. He swung down from the dun. "We walked them through, the sound." Naira nodded. She slid from the mare, landing lightly on her good foot, her wrapped ankle taking the strain with only a wince. Elias went first, leading the dun. The rock walls rose up, sheer and black, hundreds of feet on either side, blotting out the stars until only a thin, pale ribbon of sky was visible far above. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. The air was dead, still and heavy. And the sound, on the soft sand of the wash, their steps had been silent. Here, the floor was solid stone, littered with gravel. The horse's iron-shod hooves struck the ground, and the noise was a gunshot. Clack, skitter, spark. A blue spark flew as the dun's shoe hit a piece of flint. The sound echoed, bouncing from one wall to the other, a sharp, metallic report that seemed to travel for miles. Naira flinched, pulling the mare in tight. The horse's eyes were white, its ears pinned back. Elias stopped. He stood utterly still, his head tilted, listening. He was listening not for a new sound, but for their own. He was listening for the echo, waiting to see how it came back. He was listening for an echo that wasn't theirs. The sharp clack rebounded. Once, twice, a third time, growing fainter, until it was swallowed by the immense, cold darkness of the canyon. It came back clean. They were alone. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured, his hand on the dun's neck. He looked back at Naira. "Walk them on the sandy patches. Slow." He took a step. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a tracker, a hunter, reading the air itself. He led them deeper into the cut, his every sense straining, his body poised on the knife edge of action. The sluice was a trap. It was a perfect place for an ambush, but it was also the only way. They moved for what felt like a lifetime, yard by agonizing, echoing yard. The sluice twisted, turned, and narrowed, the walls pressing in, claustrophobic and threatening, as if the earth itself were trying to crush them. They were nearing the end, the high, cold pass that would lead them to the high shale. Elias was just beginning to breathe a little easier when the sound came. High up, on the rim of the canyon, a chorus of coyotes began to sing, their high, yipping hymn to the new moon. It was a wild, lonely sound, but it was a normal sound. It was the sound of an empty, unwatched world. Elias let out a slow breath. He took another step, and the chorus cut off. It didn't fade. It didn't trail off. It stopped, all at once, in the middle of a yip, as if a giant hand had been clapped over the mouth of the desert. A sentry's silence. Elias froze. He grabbed the dun's muzzle, pulling its head in. Behind him, he heard Naira's sharp, stifled intake of breath. She knew, too, something had startled the coyotes. Something big. Something that walked on two legs and carried steel. Brand, or Madden. They hadn't waited for morning. Elias's eyes scanned the rock wall beside him. It was sheer, impossible. But just ahead, he saw it. A goat path. A barely visible line of broken rock that zigzagged up the canyon wall. It was not a horse trail. It was a path for desperate things. He didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh the options. He acted. He turned, pushed past Naira, and grabbed the bridle of the sorrel mare. "No matter what, you don't let go," he ordered. He jammed the dun's reins into Naira's other hand. "And you don't make a sound." He turned and put his shoulder to the dun's chest, forcing the horse off the path, toward the steep, crumbling incline. The horse balked, snorting, its hooves scraping. "Up!" Elias hissed, his voice a violent whisper. He hauled on the bridle, finding a strength he didn't know he possessed. The dun, trusting him, scrambled, its hooves digging, sending a shower of gravel down into the sluice. Elias pushed, scrambled, and pulled. Fighting the horse and the mountain, Naira was right behind him, her hand twisted in the sorrel's mane. Her teeth gritted as she half pulled, half prayed the mare up the incline. The shale was a treacherous, shifting river of broken stone. It rattled. It slid. But it did one thing sand could not. It died young. Every track they made was instantly covered by a new slide of rock. They were erasing themselves as they climbed. They reached the top of the ridge, their lungs burning, the horses trembling and lathered in sweat. They were on a high, wind-blasted mesa, 1,000 feet above the dark trap of the sluice. Elias looked down. He saw them, 3 riders, black shapes moving with purpose into the mouth of the canyon they had just escaped. They hadn't been seen. The sentry silence of the coyotes had given them their margin. "We walk," Elias breathed, his voice raw. "We walk until dawn." They stopped hours later, on a high, flat plateau, shielded from the wind by a fortress of juniper and dark basalt. It was a dry camp, miles from water, miles from anything. The moon was high, and the stars were a cold, brilliant scatter of diamond dust. They didn't speak. They moved with the shared, silent purpose of people who had passed through a terrible, small door together. Naira slid from the mare, her body aching, her wrapped ankles screaming in protest. She went to her saddle roll, unstrapped the gray, military-issue saddle blanket, and unfolded it. It was their bed, their roof, their home. She spread it on the ground, the dust still holding a faint trace of the previous day's warmth. Elias, meantime, untied the cursed plank. He carried it, not to the edge of the cliff to throw it away, but to a small, clear circle of stones that looked like an ancient fire pit. He held the 2 pieces of splintered wood in his hands. He read the tar-black words, "No mercy for thieves. One last time in the cold starlight." He knelt and set the planks in the ring of stones, building a small pyre. He took a sulfur match from his pocket, struck it on his heel, and touched the small, sputtering flame to the splintered wood. The fire licked at the dry plank. It hesitated, then caught. The wood began to glow. Then the tar-black paint began to blister. Naira came and knelt on the other side of the small fire. They watched together. The fire ate the letters. The N of no curled, turned black, and flaked away into smoke. The T of thieves bubbled, the tar melting like angry tears. Before the flame consumed it, the lie was surrendering. The signpost was being unmade. Naira's face was lit copper by the small, bright flame. Her eyes were dry, wide, and fixed on the fire, and her lips were moving. She was whispering. She was whispering the names of her dead into the smoke. Her brother, taken in the first volley. Her mother, lost to the fire where the water used to run. The children, the elders. She was giving them to the wind, releasing them from the lie, from the shame of the tar-painted sign. It was a funeral. It was an absolution. Elias watched the last letter, the S, disappear. The curse was broken. The wood was just wood. He looked at her, at the fierce, clean line of her jaw in the firelight. He felt the weight of his own unburied dead. He felt the cold, hard knot in his chest that had lived there ever since he'd found Wyatt. He leaned forward, into the circle of light. He added one name to the smoke. "Wyatt Hart," he said. His voice was rough. "My brother." The smoke took the name with the same grave, silent courtesy. It rose, straight up in the still air, carrying the names and the lies and the pain, dissolving them into the stars. The fire burned down, fast. The planks were gone, reduced to a pile of glowing, red-gold embers. And with the fire, the heat was gone. The high desert cold rushed in, sharp and biting. Naira shivered, a deep, bone-rattling tremor. The ritual was over, and her body was remembering its weakness. Elias stood. He took off his own heavy canvas coat. He walked around the fire pit and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was heavy, stiff, and carried the smell of him, horse, old leather, lye soap, and the faint, metallic scent of gun oil. It smelled of work, of reliability. It smelled like the kind of safety you couldn't buy in any store. Naira's hands came up and clutched the lapels, pulling it tight. She leaned, just slightly, her shoulder pressing against his leg. He didn't move. He stood beside her, a bulwark against the wind. Their silence was crowded. It was filled with the things the tongue would only weaken. It was full of shared grief, of the goat path, of the sentry silence, of the name Wyatt. It was the silence of two people who had just chosen to be forged into one. They sat, finally, on the saddle blanket, their backs against a low, flat rock. They couldn't sleep, not yet. They had to rehearse the border run. Love, for them, was braided into logistics. "We're high," Elias said, his voice a low murmur, close to her ear. "They'll be in the sluice till dawn, if they're smart. When the sun comes, they'll see our trail up the shale. They'll know we're on the high ground."
"So they'll ride the ridges,"
Naira whispered, her head leaning against his shoulder. "They will, but we won't be there. We follow this mesa till it breaks. Then we drop back into the lowland, into the broken country. Boulders and arroyos. We'll make no dust. We'll walk the horses." When do we gallop?" she asked. "Not until we have to, not until the border is in sight." He said, "We have to make the fear walk, not ride. We have to breathe slow and move steady." She nodded, her hair brushing his chin. They talked for another hour, in low, practical tones, memorizing the map he had drawn in the air. Finally, the exhaustion took her. Her breathing deepened. Her head grew heavy against his shoulder. Naira drifted off, her body curled on the old, gray saddle blanket, the dust warm beneath her, his coat covering her. Elias did not sleep. He shifted, sitting upright, his back against the rock, his Winchester laid across his lap. He watched her. He watched the stars. He listened to the wind. He looked at her, asleep, the firelight gone, her face pale in the starlight. She was so small. The world was so large and so full of men with square-heeled boots. He gently pulled the collar of his coat up, covering her neck. He covered her the way prayer covers bone whole, without spectacle. A shooting star, a streak of silent, brilliant fire, tore the dark, splitting the sky from one horizon to the other. Elias watched it burn out. He and the woman sleeping at his feet were not wishing for riches, or revenge, or even for justice. Neither of them wished for anything smaller than a life. Dawn was not a comfort. It was a judgment. It showed a dull, nickel edge in the east, cold and sharp, outlining the world in gray. Elias had not slept. He sat with his back to the basalt, the Winchester across his knees, and watched the ridge he knew they would be watching. The specks bloomed against the gray light, exactly where he knew they would. 2 at first, small and tentative, then 2 more, fanning out, confident. They stopped, sitting their horses, looking down at the high mesa, reading the story of the dead fire. Then 2 more riders joined them. 6. Cole Madden had brought friends. He had spent the night gathering his posse, men fueled by the promise of a chase and the sour thrill of being right. Lieutenant Brand, Elias knew, would be slower. Brand would be following the tracks through Devil's Sluice, his approach methodical, military, and sure. Madden was a hound, and he was running on pure spite. "Naira," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the morning chill. She was already on her feet, kicking dirt over the last of the embers, tying the burlap sack to the dun saddle. She heard the flatness in his voice, looked at his face, and then followed his gaze to the ridge. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask, who? She just pulled the last knot tight. "How long?" she asked. 10 minutes, if we're lucky. They're moving fast." He was already swinging into the saddle, his movements fluid, economical. He settled the rifle across his lap. "Stay close. Don't look back." They pushed the horses over the edge of the mesa, not back the way they came, but down a steep, treacherous slide of broken shale. It was a controlled fall, the horses sitting back on their haunches, sliding and scrambling, the rattle of stones a loud, desperate announcement of their flight. From the ridge, a high, thin yell. The hunt was on. They hit the broken country at a hard gallop. This was a maze of red rock towers and thorny scrub, a land designed to tear a man apart. Elias drove the dun, his body low, pushing the horse harder than he ever had. Naira was a shadow behind him, her face pressed low to the sorrel's neck, the mare running flat out, her breath sawing in the cold air. Madden's men were on fresh horses. Elias knew he couldn't outrun them. He had to outthink them. He didn't head for the open plains. He veered sharp right into the mouth of a narrow canyon, the walls rising up, sheer and red. Naira pulled alongside him, the wind tearing at her words. "Elias, it's a dead end." "Keep riding," he yelled back. He could hear the whoops from the posse behind them. They'd seen it. They had them trapped. They slowed, spreading out, sealing the mouth of the canyon, savoring the kill. Elias didn't slow. He rode straight for the sheer back wall, a solid face of red rock. Naira's heart hammered. She closed her eyes, trusting him, at the last possible second. Elias angled the dun hard left, disappearing behind a high, thick scrim of ancient, thorny mesquite. The branches tore at them, ripping Elias's coat, snatching at Naira's hair. But behind it, invisible from the canyon's mouth, was a narrow, winding cattle path, a goat run cut switchback style up the sheer face of the canyon wall. "Go, go!" Elias yelled, slapping the sorrel's rump to send her up first. The mare scrambled, her hooves digging for purchase on the steep, gravelly path. Naira clung to her mane. Elias was right behind her, the dun grunting with the effort. They were halfway up, exposed against the rock, 2 perfect targets against a red canvas. The rifle cracked. It wasn't a pistol shot. It was a big-bore buffalo gun, a .50 caliber. The sound was flat and heavy, an arrival, not a warning. Elias felt the impact before he heard the sound. It was not a sting. It was a physical, violent punch, as if a fist had been driven through his back. The heavy, slow-moving slug tore through the canvas of his coat, kissed his ribs, spun, and bit deep, lodging in the thick muscle and gristle of his side. "Ha!" The air was punched out of him. His vision flared white. He didn't fall from the saddle, but he folded. His hands went slack on the reins, his body pitching sideways, a dead weight. He was going. Naira heard the flat whump of the shot, heard his pained, sudden gasp. She didn't look back to see who fired. She didn't scream. She didn't have time for fear. She wheeled the sorrel mare in a tight, dust-choking pivot on the impossibly narrow path. The horse screamed, its front hooves dancing on the edge of the drop. As Elias's body slumped, she was there. She drove the mare in, knee to knee with the dun. She didn't reach for his arm. She plunged her hand down and grabbed the thick leather of his gun belt, her fingers locking around the steel buckle. She took his full, dead weight, her small body straining, the muscles in her arm burning with a fire that matched the one in his side. A second shot splintered the rock where Elias's head had been. Ping thwack! Hot lead fragments stung her cheek. "Move! Move!" Naira shrieked, her voice a raw tear in the air. She didn't let go. She held his belt, keeping him in the saddle by pure, desperate will, dragging him as she spurred the sorrel forward. The dun, leaderless, scrambled after. His reins tangled. She hauled him 20 yards up the winding path, around a sharp basalt overhang, and into the deep, black shade of a rock shelf. They were out of the line of fire, for 1 second. Elias slid from the saddle. He didn't fall. He just crumpled, landing hard on the shale, his body folding onto his hands and knees. His head hung, his hat falling into the dust. Below them, the posse was yelling, confused by the vanishing act. Lead began to chew the lip of the wash. Speculative shots fired at the mesquite scrim, wasting bullets.
Elias, Elias, look at me.
Naira was off the mare, kneeling in front of him in the dust. His face was a shocking, pale gray, a sheen of cold sweat beading on his forehead and upper lip. He was breathing through his teeth, a sharp, shallow, rhythmic hiss. "I'm fine," he gasped, his eyes squeezed shut. "Get on the horse. I can ride." "You're a liar," she said. Her voice was shaking, but the words were hard as iron. His blood said otherwise. It was not a trickle. It was a dark, pulsing stain spreading across his shirt, soaking the heavy canvas coat, dripping from his side onto the pale gray shale. It was too much, too fast. She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed the hem of his heavy shirt, the one she had mended just the night before. She put her weight into it and tore, ripping a long, thick strip of cloth. "Lean forward," she commanded. He obeyed, collapsing onto his forearms. She pulled the torn coat and shirt aside. The wound was a ragged, dark hole, high on his back ribs. It was welling blood, a steady, dark surge. It hadn't hit a lung. He'd be coughing blood, but it was deep. She had nothing clean, nothing. She looked at her hands, caked in dust and horse sweat. She looked at her own clothes. Without hesitation, she ripped a long, clean strip from the hem of her own chemise, hidden beneath her skirt. She wadded the clean cotton. "This is going to hurt," she said. She pressed the wadded cloth into the wound, hard. Elias's body went rigid. A low, terrible groan was forced from his chest, a sound of deep rock agony that had nothing to do with air. "Don't you pass out!" she hissed, her voice fierce. "Don't you dare! Breathe!" She packed the hole, a brutal, practical, intimate act. The bleeding slowed, but it was still too much. She needed pressure. She tore his red scarf from his neck. She looped it around his chest, over the packing, and tied it. She tied it with a vicious, hard knot, pulling it so tight it made him gasp for air. "Breathe," she said again. "I am," he hissed through his teeth. "No, breathe with me." She put her hand on his good shoulder, her grip hard enough to bruise. In, out, she murmured a rhythm, a cadence, something to anchor his spinning senses to, a voice to match his breathing to keep him from sliding into the gray, cold shock that was waiting to claim him. Below, the shooting stopped. The yelling changed. "They ain't here. They went up." Madden's men had pushed past the mesquite. They'd found the cattle path, but in their haste, they'd missed the sharp, hidden turnoff to the goat path. They were fanning wrong, following the wider trail to its own dead end. They were safe from Madden. For 5 minutes. But Elias, his head now hanging, his breath coming in ragged pants, looked back toward the main basin. He saw the new dust, a slower, more organized column. 4 riders. Brand, he whispered. The lieutenant, slower, but sure, Brand wouldn't miss the trail. He would read the signs. He would see the blood. Time was a thin, splintered plank over a very deep, dark well. "We can't ride," Naira said, her voice flat. She had seen the blood on the saddle. "He can't stay on the horse, and they'll hear us."
Got to,
Elias whispered, his eyes closed.
No.
Naira's eyes, sharp and feral, were scanning the rock face. She was a survivor. She knew how to hide. Her people had been hiding for 100 years, erased from the land they lived on. Her gaze locked on something Elias had missed. A crack, a dark, vertical seam in the basalt, hidden by a tangle of dead, thorny vines. It wasn't a path. It was a fissure, a place where water used to run in the spring melt. It was just wide enough for a person, not a horse. It was stone made of pure disappear. She pointed. "There!" "The horses!" Elias protested, his voice a ghost. "Toulouse is done."
The horses are loud,
Naira said, her voice cutting.
"They're a target. We go now."
She was already hauling him. She got his arm over her shoulder, took his weight. He cried out, a sharp, bitten-off sound as the wound pulled. He staggered, leaning his full weight on her. She was a reed, but she was a reed made of steel. She half dragged, half carried him 10 feet to the seam in the rock.
"Get in."
Elias looked back, once, at his dun. The horse was standing, reins trailing, watching him, its ears pricked, confused. It was like leaving his own heart standing on the path. He turned, grit in his teeth, and plunged into the dark crack. It was not a path. It was a crawl. The rock was sharp, tearing at their knees, at their hands. Elias was leaking. He left a smeared, dark trail on the stone. He was moving on will alone. His boot slipped on a patch of his own wet blood. He went down, his chin hitting the rock. "Damn it all," he cursed, his voice a raw echo in the tight space. He slammed his good fist into the rock wall. "Damn this whole bloody sky." He sagged, his strength gone. "I'm done! Naira, I'm done! Leave me! Go!" Naira, who was right behind him, pushing him, stopped. Her breath was coming in sobs, but her eyes were dry fire. She grabbed a handful of his hair and yanked his head back, hard.
"You selfish fool!"
She swore at him, her voice a low, furious hiss that was more violent than any gunshot. "You don't get to die. I didn't pull you from that dirt just to plant you in this one. You hear me? Elias Hart. You will move." She swore at him again. A string of hard, sharp words she'd learned from mule skinners and soldiers. Words a ranch hand who knew every busted gate on the range would have respected. Elias, lost in the gray fog of shock and pain, heard her. He heard the pure, unvarnished grit. The absolute refusal. He let out a sharp, surprised bark of a laugh, which immediately turned into a wet, agonizing cough. He spit, a dark glob landing on the rock. All right, he gasped. "Don't get your dander up." He found a new grip. He planted a hand. He started to crawl. Crawl, haul, breathe, repeat. That was the entire world, the scrape of his boot leather, the tear of his jeans on the rock, the hot, sticky wetness in his side, the hiss of his breathing, the low, fierce murmur of her voice behind him. Again, that's it, again. They were 2 hearts, making a noise in the seam of the rock that was louder, more desperate, than 6 horses galloping behind them. They could see the light, a bright, hot patch of daylight at the end of the fissure. 50 more feet. A new voice. It echoed from behind them, down in the crawl space. In here I see him, I see the blood. Madden. He'd found the goat path. He'd seen the abandoned horses. He was in the seam. A shot roared. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. A physical blow to their ears. The bullet ricocheted, whining like a furious, trapped hornet. Ping-zing. "Go, go!" Elias yelled, finding a last desperate surge. They reached the mouth of the choke. Naira burst out first, scrambling into the blinding sunlight, and turned, her hands reaching for Elias. A second shot. This one was from the canyon floor, far below. One of Madden's men, who had circled around. He was aiming at her. The bullet hit the stone just by her shoulder. Thwack! A spray of hot rock grit and lead fragments freckled her cheek. Naira didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her eyes just narrowed, her face hardening into a mask of pure, cold fury. Elias, being hauled out, saw it. He saw that unblinking stare. He saw the woman who had been tied to a tree, who had been left to die, who had just sworn him up a rock face. He saw in that unblinking, grit-flecked gaze the whole, entire reason to stay alive. They were trapped. A narrow choke. Madden was coming up behind them. The man below was reloading. They had 1 second. Naira's hand went to Elias's belt. His heavy Colt Peacemaker was still holstered. She pulled it. The weight of it was solid, real, a balance to the chaos. She didn't aim at the man below. She didn't aim into the darkness behind her. She aimed at a dead, dry log, a piece of ancient, sun-bleached wood, perched precariously on the rock ledge just above the man below. She took a breath. She steadied her arm with her other hand, just as he had taught her to steady the rifle. She fired one, calm, deliberate round. The shot was clean. The heavy .45 slug hit the log dead center. The dry wood didn't just break, it exploded. It detonated, sending a cloud of razor-sharp splinters, like 1,000 angry hornets, straight down. The man below cried out, a high, thin sound, shielding his face as the splinters rained down on him. From the darkness of the seam, they heard Madden curse as the noise and the sudden chaos made him flinch. It was long enough. Now, Naira said. She grabbed Elias by his coat. They didn't run. They punched through the narrow choke and they fell. They tumbled, slid, and rolled down a steep, 50-foot embankment, a controlled avalanche of dust and small stones. They landed, bruised, bleeding, and gasping, in a wide, sandy wash. The sand was soft. It was quiet. And as they lay there, the sky spinning above them, the wind was already blowing, smoothing their tracks, erasing the story of their fall. It was a forgiving ledger, writing their debts clean. They were, for now, gone. Weeks later, weeks that felt like a lifetime, a different season, a different world. The sandy wash had been their salvation, a forgiving ledger that erased their tracks and led them south, always south, into a country that had given up on being anything but itself. They had walked for 2 days, Elias leaning on Naira, a dead weight, his side a fiery, weeping agony, his mind a gray fog of pain. She had been his legs, his will, his compass. She had found this place, or maybe the place had found them. It was called San Isidro Bend, a deep, lazy curve in a creek that hadn't forgotten the meaning of water. It was a creek that didn't brag. It just ran, clear and steady, over smooth, moss-covered stones. A thick grove of cottonwood trees, old and tall, stood witness, their leaves a vibrant, shocking green, a testament to the rain that always, eventually, remembered to fall here. It was a pocket of life in a world of high, dry plains. It was south of trouble and, they hoped, just north of forgetting. Here, they stopped. Here, they collapsed. The first week was a blur of fever and pain. The slug was deep. Naira had to get it out. She'd used his skinning knife, boiled in the fire. and a half bottle of traded whiskey he'd had in his sack, half for the wound, half for him to drink. It was a brutal, bloody business in the shade, a nightmare of gritted teeth and whispered apologies. But she had done it. She had saved his life, not with tenderness, but with a hard, unblinking necessity. Now, weeks later, the healing had begun. It was a slow, domestic lyric, written by calloused hands. Elias began to mend, his body stubborn, his will even more so. The wound in his side was a puckered, angry star, but it was closed. His left arm was stiff, the muscles torn, and for a week he could only work one-handed. He started mending fences. Not his fences, but the ruins of an old, long-gone homesteader's corral. He worked with one arm, tying knots with his teeth in his right hand, cursing, sweating, his face pale. It was his way of reclaiming himself, one busted rail at a time. Naira would watch him from a distance. Then, without a word, come and hold the rail steady for him. He would grunt, a sound of thanks, and they would work. A silent, powerful team. He worked until the day he tried to lift a heavy rock. His left arm gave way, and he stood, trembling with frustration, staring at his own useless hand. He waited, and after a long minute, he tried again, and the arm, grudgingly, agreed to help. While he healed his body, Naira healed her mind. She started a garden in the rich, dark soil by the creek. She planted the last handful of beans from their sack and the wild seeds she'd gathered on the trek. She was planting roots, digging her fingers into earth that would not betray her. They had found a collapsed sadi, the same as his, but smaller. The roof caved in. They worked, side by side, to rebuild it. They salvaged driftwood from the creek, cut fresh sod from the bank. Naira found an old, rusted tin sheet and nailed it over the worst of the leaks. The rhythmic tack-tack-tack of her hammer a song of domesticity, of claiming. Elias, his arm now able to lift, fixed the door frame. She joked, as he winced, that he was more stubborn than the warped wood. He'd looked at her, and a slow smile, his first true smile, had touched his face. "Reckon I am," he'd said, and she had laughed. A real, full laugh. It was a sound so unexpected and bright that he'd stopped his work just to listen. It was as if she had stitched that laughter into the lintels of the door frame, a charm against the past. They built a lean-to for the horses they didn't have. Then they finished the one small room. Then they built a home. It was small, just 4 walls of mud and wood. But it was theirs. They had found some splintered planks from a washed-out bridge and used them for a table. They measured the boards not with a rule, but by laying their hands side by side, his broad, scarred palm next to her slender, strong one. They measured by the width of their joined palms. One afternoon, while Elias was down by the creek, Naira took the piece of charcoal she'd saved from their first night's fire. She stood on a rock and, above the new, sturdy door, she drew a mark. It was not the split-wing hawk of her lost people. It was a new symbol, a river bird, like the ones that nested in the cottonwoods, its wings whole, its head turned toward the sunrise. A river bird mended. There was no fire in this drawing, only flight. When Elias came back, he saw it. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at her, her face smudged with black. He didn't say, "It's beautiful." He just nodded, once, and touched the lintel as he walked in, as if blessing her mark. He left one morning, walking, his rifle in hand. He was gone for 3 days. Naira's fear, the old, cold panic, began to creep back. She worked in the garden, her eyes fixed on the northern ridge, her hands shaking. He came back on the evening of the 3rd day. He was not alone. He was riding his dun gelding and leading the sorrel mare, and behind them, on a lead rope, trotted a wild, stringy Mustang, its eyes wide with terror. "They found you," She breathed, her hand flying to her throat. "No," he said, swinging down. He was gaunt, exhausted, but his eyes were alive. They went back, Brand and Madden. They split up. I found their trail. Madden went back to Ash Mesa. Brandy went north, back to his fort. They lost us. He'd found the horses grazing in a box canyon, abandoned when the posse gave up. He'd had to hunt the Mustang for a day and a half to catch it. That night, they ate the jackrabbit he'd shot, and it was a feast. The next day, Elias began to train the Mustang. He did it not with rope and spur, but with a quiet, endless patience. He just stood in the corral with the horse for hours, letting the animal learn his smell, his stillness. He worked with a patience he had learned from her. He had learned it, he realized, from watching her teach herself how to sleep again. She woke gasping fewer nights now. The nightmares still came, the ghosts of the blue uniforms and the tar-black sign, but they were fading. On the worst nights, when she thrashed, her hands clawing at a phantom rope. He didn't try to hold her. He didn't offer empty comforts. He just sat up, lit the lantern, and put his solid, warm hand on her back. A steady pressure. "I'm here." He'd say, "You're at San Isidro. You're safe." And he would sit with her, counting breaths in the dark, his presence an anchor, until the gray light of dawn added another, safer color to the walls, and the dreams receded. A month passed, then two. The garden grew. The Mustang learned to accept a bridle. Their life took on a rhythm, the rhythm of the creek, the wind, the work. One day, a new sound, a rattling wagon. Elias had the Winchester in his hand before the wagon even cleared the trees. It was a peddler, an old, wizened man named Jebediah Smith, his wagon piled high with pots, bolts of cloth, tinware, and news. He was the telegraph of the Badlands. They traded 2 fine rabbit pelts for a sack of salt, a new skinning knife for Naira, and a handful of coffee beans. And they listened. "Ash Mesa," Jebediah cackled, spitting tobacco juice. "That place is gnawing on a scandal bigger'n a buffalo. Turns out that fella whose wife was hurt, the one who blamed the savages, lit out, fled. Seems he owed a—" The peddler paused. "A powerful sum of money to a fella in Santa Fe, and folks are saying his wife was gonna tell the law. Just up and vanished. The lie that fed that whole fire, well, it's starving now. Madden's yelling about it, but no one's listening. They're too busy looking for the husband." Naira stood very, very still. Her hands, which had been gripping a bolt of blue calico, slowly uncurled. The lie was dead. It had died of its own accord, out in the world. Without her, she was not a thief. She was not a scapegoat. She was just Naira. She let the cloth go and looked at Elias. He was watching her, and in his eyes, she saw the last chain break. The peddler left, and the world he brought with him left, too. But some of it stayed. They had traded jerky for books, 2 to be exact, a worn copy of the Bible, and a tattered book of Mr. Shakespeare's plays. Naira, who had never been taught, began to learn her letters. She would sit by the fire, her brow furrowed, her finger tracing the words on the labels of the tin cans they'd bought, COFFEE, she'd say aloud, SUGAR. Elias would sit and whittle, pretending not to listen. He taught her the sounds. He taught her how to hold a pen. One night, she took the slate, the same slate from his old life, which they had brought with them. She took the chalk, and she wrote, her letters still crooked, but smooth. She wrote his name, Elias Hart. He looked at it. He looked at her face proud, her eyes bright with the light of this new, hard-won power. He turned his head away, quickly, and scrubbed a hand over his face. He pretended the wood smoke was in his eyes, but she saw the glint of tears on his rough cheek. They planted the cotton seeds the peddler had sold them. They planted them down by the creek, a small, hopeful patch of green. They planted prayers with them, prayers for a future, for a harvest. for a life. They found that both cotton and prayers were finicky, delicate things, but with enough work and enough faith, they were both possible. One warm evening, when the air was soft and the creek was singing its evening song, they stood by the bank. Naira was looking out at the water, her hands clasped in front of her. Elias came and stood behind her. He didn't wrap his arms around her. He just rested his hands on hers, his big, calloused hands covering her small, strong ones. He pressed his palms against hers, over her belly. The space was flat, strong. It was not yet with child. It was only full of tomorrow. But in that gesture, in the shared warmth, the question was asked, and the answer was given. This was the future. This was the home. "We should get papers," she said, her voice quiet. She said the word out loud. "Marriage." Elias rested his chin on the top of her head. He breathed in the scent of her hair. "We should," he agreed. "A priest or a judge, if one can be found." She leaned back against his chest. "If one can be found," she repeated. But, he said, "we're here today." They decided, in that quiet moment, to be wed twice, once by a man of the law, if the world ever required it, and once, right now, by the river. They stood under the broad, kind shade of the largest cottonwood, the one they called the Guardian. There was no one to watch. There was no book, no ring. There was only the sound of the water, the rustle of the leaves, and the truth. They turned to face each other. He took her hands. They were not holy hands. They were hands that had cleaned wounds, built walls, and learned to write a name. I don't have the words. Naira," he began, his voice rough. "Then we use our own," she said. "We vow the small promises, the ones that outlast the big ones." He nodded, understanding. He gripped her hands. "I vow," he said, his voice slow and sure, "to warn you of bad weather. I vow to clean my rifle away from the food." She laughed, a small, choked sound. "I vow," she said, her turn, "to share the last biscuit, even if it's my half." "I vow to tell the truth," he said, his eyes locking on hers, "before it grows teeth and bites us." "I vow," she said, her voice growing thick, "to sit with you when the nightmares come." "I vow," he said, his voice breaking, "to keep you warm and to keep you safe." "No," she said, her grip tightening on his. "You keep me warm. I'll keep us safe." She smiled, a small, fierce, beautiful smile. "And I vow to keep you honest." He looked at her, this woman he had found in the dirt, this woman who had saved him in the rocks, this woman who had built a life with him from mud and hope. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of salt and coffee and promise. It was a kiss that sealed the vow, a vow the wind and the water and the trees were there to witness. It was all the paper they needed. The past is a tracker. It never gets tired. It never needs to sleep. It just follows, one slow, patient step at a time, until it finds you. The tracker finally arrived at San Isidro Bend on an evening in late summer. The cottonwoods were heavy with green, the creek was low and singing, and the air was soft. It came at dusk, the one time of day that was neither light nor dark, the time of day for ghosts. Elias was splitting wood, his left arm strong again, the movement clean and powerful. The thwack of the axe was the only sound, a steady heartbeat. Naira was by the creek, washing 2 tin plates, humming a low, tuneless song. And then the creek stopped. She felt the silence first. The birds in the cottonwoods went quiet. She looked up, her hands still in the water, and saw them. 3 riders, framed against the purple sky, sitting their horses at the edge of the clearing. One was a trooper, stiff and anonymous. One was Lieutenant Silas Brand, and the one in the middle, his tin star catching the last bloody light of the sun, was Cole Madden. Madden had a grin on his face. It was a wolf-like, triumphant thing. He had them. He had stitched the trail, from the abandoned horses, to the blood on the rocks, to the peddler's vague rumors of a new couple in the Badlands. He had finally stitched it all together. He nudged his horse forward, into the clearing, into their home. He tried to bring his swagger with him. He was the law, and this was the end of the line. But the swagger didn't fit. The clearing was too quiet, the creek too steady, the two people watching him too solid. The sound of the river seemed to steal the arrogance from his boots, leaving him looking what he was, a small, angry man who'd ridden too far. Elias had set the axe down. He hadn't moved for his rifle, which leaned against the soddy door. Just 10 feet away. He just stood, his hands open, watching. "Well, well," Madden said, his voice trying too hard to be a drawl. "Look-a here, Brand. Told you this was the place. Hiding out. The thief and her sympathizer." Lieutenant Brand did not speak. He dismounted, his movement stiff. He, too, looked tired. He walked forward, his eyes not on Elias but on Naira. He stopped, 20 feet away. He had a piece of paper in his hand. Naira stood up from the creek. She wiped her wet hands on her skirt. She was not the shaking, fever-bright woman in the bed. She was not the desperate girl in the dirt. She was the woman who had built a home with her own hands. Before Elias could take a single step, before he could say a single word to protect her, Naira stepped forward. She walked past the woodpile, past Elias, and stopped, facing the lieutenant. She did not look at Madden. She looked at Brand. "My name," she said, her voice clear and carrying, with no tremor in it, "is Naira Vega, and I am not a thief." Brand's face, burned red by the sun, hardened. He held up the paper. "Ma'am, I have a warrant, a writ, for your arrest, in connection with the lie," Naira said, cutting him off. Madden's grin faltered. "Now you listen here, girl." "No," Naira said, her voice like iron. "You listen." She took a step closer to Brand, and she began to speak. She did not plead. She did not cry. She named the dead. "I am from the Red Creek Band. You burned our camp for a lie. Ma'am, the law states—" "You burned it," she repeated, her voice rising. A cold, clean fire. "You let ranchers with greed in their hearts join your soldiers. You burned our tents. You scattered our families. You killed my brother, who was just 15. You killed my mother, who was mending a blanket." "This is not—" Brand started, his face going rigid. "And when you were done," she said, her voice dropping to a low, terrible whisper, "when you couldn't find any more men to hunt, you found me. You tied me to a tree. Your men did. You left me for dead, and you left a sign, calling me a thief, a sign to cover the sin, a sign made of a used-up lie." Brand's face was stone. He looked at the woman in front of him. She was not the brown-eyed thief on his paper. She was a general, naming her fallen. The truth of what she was saying, the sheer, unvarnished weight of it, was a thing that outranked his orders. It was a truth that made his piece of paper feel thin and cheap. He fumbled in his other pocket. We have new information. The widower, from Meseta Draw, he confessed. He took his wife's life. He has fled." "So you know," Naira whispered, her eyes burning into his. "You know it was a lie, and you are still here, with him." She nodded at Madden. "You are still here, with a warrant, to take me, for what? Lieutenant, for surviving." The clearing was utterly silent. There was only the sound of the creek. Brand had no answer. Elias had been watching. He had been watching Brand's face. He saw the man of paper break. He saw the man, the human, underneath, struggling. This was not a gunfight. It was a reckoning. Slowly, Elias' heart walked to the soddy. He picked up his Winchester. Madden's hand went to his gun. "Don't you do it, Hart!" Elias ignored him. He walked. the rifle held loose in one hand, to the center of the clearing, to an old, flat cottonwood stump where he split his kindling, and with all of them watching, he laid the Winchester down on the stump. He laid it down, its barrel pointing at the empty sky. It was not surrender. It was not a plea. It was an invitation. It was a statement. The killing is done. The violence ends here. Now we do what is right. We do it with empty hands. Brand stared at the rifle. He looked at Elias, at the man's scarred, hard face, at his empty hands. He looked at Naira, who stood, unmoving, her truth hanging in the air like a blade. He was a man caught between two worlds, the world of paper, of orders, of the law, which said he must take her into custody, and the world of the river, the trees, the truth, the world of the man beside her who bled the right kind of courage, the courage to put his gun down, not to pick it up. Cole Madden saw none of this. He saw no moral dilemma. He saw a man who had put down his gun. He saw his victory, his authority, being stolen by a woman's words and a man's silence. He saw his chance. "If you won't do it, Brand," he snarled, "then I will. She's a fugitive." He spurred his horse, lunging, not for Naira, but for the rifle on the stump. He was going to take the gun. He was going to take control. He never made it. Brand moved. He didn't draw his pistol. He didn't shout. He took 2 fast, hard steps, and his boot, his square-heeled, cavalry-issue boot, came down. It pinned Cole Madden's wrist, the one reaching for the rifle, to the flat top of the stump, a crack of bone, a high, thin scream from Madden. The army, in that one, swift motion, chose not to be a hangman today. "That'll be enough. Madden," Brand said, his voice dead. He looked down at the man writhing under his boot, his hand trapped. You broke my—" Madden gasped, his face white with pain and shock. "The law," Brand said, his voice cold, "is for justice, not for spite. You're a long way from home." He lifted his boot. Madden scrambled back, clutching his wrist, his face a mask of hate and humiliation. Brand turned to Elias and Naira. He was, Elias realized, deeply ashamed. He looked at the piece of paper in his hand. The warrant. He looked at the other paper. The confession. He slowly, deliberately, folded them together. "My orders," he said, his voice low. "We're to find a thief. I've been riding for 2 days. I haven't seen a thief." He looked straight at Naira, his eyes cold, but with a new, deep light in them. "I didn't see her." The words hung in the air. In that legal invisibility, in that official lie, was the first decent, honest thing he had done all year. He turned to Madden, who was cradling his broken wrist. "Get on your horse. Ride back to Ash Mesa. It needs a deputy, but it needs one who can read the wind, not just his own bile. You're not it." Madden stared at him, speechless. He climbed onto his horse, his face twisted, and without a word, yanked the animal's head around and rode out of the clearing, small and broken, his tin star now just a heavy, useless anchor he couldn't carry anymore. Brand stood alone. He looked at Naira. He didn't apologize. The word was too small. Instead, he gave her the only thing he had. He nodded, a sharp, curt, respectful motion. It was the nod of a soldier, saluting a general he had never met. He turned, walked to his horse, and mounted. The young trooper, who had watched the entire thing, his face a mask of confusion, followed. Brand rode away, not looking back. He rode away with fewer men than he had brought, and a hell of a lot more truth than he had wanted. They were gone. The clearing was empty again. The sound of the river, which had been holding its breath, resumed its sermon. Elias' heart sagged, the strength that had held him upright, the iron in his spine, suddenly melted. He leaned against the stump, his legs weak. He looked at Naira, who was watching him, her face pale. And he laughed. It was a rough, choked, exhausted sound. A laugh of pure, unadulterated relief. A laugh that said, "We are alive." Naira looked at him, her own face trembling, and her laugh joined his. A high, clear, beautiful sound. It was the sound of the mended river bird. Their laughter joined, rose up, and became a roof over both their heads, stronger than any sod or tin. The months turned. The green of the cottonwoods turned to a brilliant, defiant gold, then fell, leaving the trees in their honest, skeletal state. The creek grew cold. The first snow fell, a light, clean blanket. And then the spring came, and the cottonwoods fuzzed with new, pale green. Inside the soddy, there was a new sound. Elias had spent the winter carving a cradle from a single, gnarled piece of juniper. A baby's first cry, a daughter. The cry was a powerful, demanding sound. It was a new, strong knot tying two bloodlines, one of the mesa, one of the plains, into a single rope, a rope of heritage and hope, a rope that would not break. On an evening that remembered every other evening, an evening in the next summer, when the world was soft and warm, Naira walked from the house. She was carrying the old, gray, military-issue saddle blanket. She spread it on the warm ground, under the guardian cottonwood. Elias came out, the baby asleep on his shoulder. He sat beside her, carefully. He looked at the blanket he had first found her with, the one that had been her only shield, the one he had covered her with, in his bed, the one they had sat on, planning their escape, the one that had been their first home, on the high mesa. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He looked at his daughter, at her small, perfect face, a mixture of his hard jaw and Naira's dark, deep eyes. He looked at his wife. He reached over and pulled the edge of the old, familiar wool, his coat long since worn out, and covered her shoulders. He said the rest of the vow, the one they had started under a different sky. "I'll keep you warm," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You keep me honest." Naira smiled and closed her eyes, the wind rustling the cottonwood leaves above their heads. At last, had nothing left to argue about. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.